It wasn't long ago that the United States only had to hint at some countries what it wanted, and they would get the message, and they'd probably pretty much fall in line because that was the order and also the power of the United States. Now that's no longer the case. And so you're going to see a more fragmented policy in which most countries are interested in what's good for them and how do they pursue that. So you're going to see some countries align with one side or the other, and most countries in the world not align and do deals. And so that will be a much more fragmented type of policy. So yes, BRICS will rise. BRICS countries, which are, let's call them the non-aligned countries, generally speaking, although part of that is China and Russia. That's part of the BRICS, part of that. But it is the non-US dominated, non-G7, non-European countries that are creating this alternative. Now, what that'll be is they are not all in agreement with everything, but they do think they have one thing in common, and that is to get out from under the American system or to be controlled by the United States. That changes the role of the United States. We have an America first policy, okay? No longer the world order as it was. The world order as it was after World War II was that how do we work with each other in those countries? What are the rules? And establishing a rule-based, what we would say also a moral-driven type of world order in which there are multinational organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and all those organizations operating by a set of rules. That's obsolete now. We now have an America first policy in which then other countries then are increasingly pressured to be with us or against us. And now you're seeing this line up in preparation for what side are you on? So that is the change that we're going to see. And we are in the process of developing. You're going to have more strong-armed conflict, a much more muscular power and testing of powers and getting around that. You're going to have much less following the United States. So that lends itself to doing those things that'll reduce their control, such as developing an alternative medium of exchange and perhaps an alternative storehold of wealth. I don't think they're going to develop an alternative storehold of wealth, but I do think we have our storehold of wealth, which is treasury bonds or bonds. We're going to have problems with that. So anyway, it is that alternative organization that is not the US dominated world order. That also, by the way, constitutes about 85% of the world's population and now counts. Yeah. And you're going to see a shift in that direction. The idea of the United States dominating and being controlling is no longer going to be the case. It'll be a power. It'll certainly be a great power, but it's each pursuing their own interest in deals in a more interesting, in a more independent way is part of it. They do not, the world sees it differently. The United States sees it in the way I just described. In other words, there's internal, how do I control the internal? And then how do I deal in an America first policy with the outside world? Most of the world says, I don't want to get involved in your fights and your arguments. I don't care what you want. You're pursuing your self-interest. And instead, I have my own developmental issues, and I'm not going to follow in the same way. That's the characterization of what it is like in the world. Everything that happens has causes to make it happen. And so it's like a machine. And so there are 5 major forces that work together to determine how this thing works. The changing world order. The world order is changing. Those 5 forces are first a credit, money, debt force. In other words, the way that works is you get credit, that's buying power. It produces debt. You have to pay it back. But the buying produces economic output. So there's that cycle. You have too much debt, you have a problem, and you have to go through an adjustment process. There's a mechanics to that. The second one that you're talking about is the internal order and disorder changing domestic order. And as you point out, there's the left and the right, and that's Democrats and Republicans. And there are times when they're very different and they're fighting to win at all cost. And that can be disruptive, and how that works is important. The third one is the international order. There's a system of how countries operate with each other. That's the order. And there's a dynamic for that. Number 4 is acts of nature. Droughts, floods, endemics are a force, a big force. Nature is a big force. And so climate change and so on is important. And number 5 is technology. Man's inventive that produces technologies. They have an effect, and they all interact. You're going to see the country run and the government run a lot more like a capitalist business, in which, imagine a new leader comes in and you have an old company that's not doing so well. Maybe that's IBM or Boeing or something, and they're coming in and they're doing a renovation. And so you're going to see technologies be used. You're going to see a game plan develop to make the government run in a more efficient and cost-efficient way. And you're going to see what we call an industrial policy, which is a policy for the country, the business, to operate that rather than a purely free market economy. In other words, it'll have direction. You're going to see deregulation. You're going to see changes in legislation. You're going to see an emphasis for it to be productive and to be effective, with an eye on what that means internationally and the competition. For example, in technology, you either win the technology war or you lose the technology war. The technology war means if you win it economically, whoever the winner is will win it economically and will win it militarily, so that internationally we have that same competition. So what you've done and you've brought us back to what is the most consequential development of that second force, this internal order and disorder. Fortunately, we had a situation where there's a fairly clear mandate, and they were not arguing about the elections. So we've had an orderly transition of power from the left, the Democrats and so on, to rather hard. And so what does that represent is your question. That represents 2 important forces. I'll say them, give the headlines, and then go below that. But first, in reforms, internal reforms, to reform the government and to reform the country in certain ways that I'll get into in a second. And second, internationally, for the preparation for war. Doesn't mean we're going to have war, but to be prepared for war and to have a type of war with the rising power, China, and then its allies, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are considered that other side. So they would then say that what we will do is we are going to improve productivity in the United States by these operations. We're going to enable, but we also are going to improve productivity. And so those improvements in productivity will help to offset the higher cost of tariffs, because money moves around that way. So if I can get $1 out of a tariff, or I can get $1 out of taxes, I have to think, where am I going to get the most dollars, and what does getting it mean in terms of taxes, and what am I going to do with that dollar? And so there's a belief that by running the country like a company, in a sense, to be able to make it productive, and by supporting that, we will get self-sufficiency, we'll get greater security, and we'll get greater productivity, which will make the country better than if it's operating highly inefficiently, depending on imported goods to be cheap. I think it depends. I will make the argument for what those who are creating this and behind this would say. I think they would say, first of all, that the tariffs can raise a lot of money, and they can raise a lot more money than wealth taxes, for example, or some of the other taxes. And so they have 2 benefits. They will bring in tax money, and they will create a protected environment. And so, yes, that'll mean higher goods prices, But if you take that tax revenue and, in a sense, taxes are a type of inflation. If you raise taxes, it's a type of inflation on people. Okay. And that might not be in the consumer price index, but it's taking money out of the pockets of people in the form of taxes too. Think of it as operating as two different systems. And so you're going to have two different technologies in the world. For example, there's going to be a China-based technology, there's going to be an American-based technology, and there'll be two separate technologies. I'm referring just to this AI, all of those technologies, because they are a threat to each other. So and they need self-sufficiency. If you're in a war, you can't be dependent on parts or things that are going to come in from other places that could be shut off. So you're going to have this, you're going to see a lot more conflict, and you're going to see a lot more economic independence. That is going to undermine efficiency, but benefit self-sufficiency. So the idea that I'll print more money and give it away is a transfer of wealth, essentially, from that undermines proper lending of money, and because that balance has to be taken care of. Are you wastefully producing the money, or are you productively producing the money? And the cost, like anything else, make it free, okay, and you're not going to have it handled. You're going to produce more inflation. So, and if you are in a position where you make interest rates not high enough for the creditor and not in that balance, then what you're going to have is inflation. You're going to have that money coming out. And worse than just the new supply of money is that people won't want to hold the debt instruments that they're holding. Because the way that storehold of wealth is, when you hold a bond, you get this money that everybody's printing, and it's going to go down in value, okay? And you don't want that. You'd rather hold it in some things that are going to hold their value. And that's basic. We have a number of businesses which are not their national champions, but they may not be the most efficient. And so you will see the desire to bring in capabilities from other countries producing chips. Boeing has a problem. Where are we going to get it? So you will see foreigners coming to produce within the United States. But it was going to be much more focused within the United States to make it more capable, more profitable, and more independent. So that's what that piece is going to look like. So the goal is in 20 to have 20% of the key chips be able to be produced within the United States. But think about them. They're being produced in Taiwan, which has this geopolitical thing going on, and that's a scary thought. So you're going to see that. You're going to see then the support in an industrial policy for enabling that. So there'll be protectionism, there will be tariffs. Certainly those ideas that stuff coming in will make it more expensive, because you no longer could go to the world supermarket and buy whatever's most cost effective for you. But it will at the same time develop those industries. This was very much like Germany after World War I, or Japan. This is very much a policy that is a more autocratic, controlling the economy, directing it to be self-sufficient with protectionism and so on. So that will be stimulating to those businesses. It doesn't work in reality because it's a very basic thing. There's a debtor and a creditor, okay? The creditor has savings, and so in saving, they want to receive a return on their money. And if that money does not provide them with a real return, they'll put it into something else, gold, something else, and so on. So you have to have interest rates that are high enough so that the creditor gets a good return, but not so high that it breaks the back of the debtor. And when you have a lot of that debt and so on, that balancing act, because one man's debt's another man's assets, you have that balancing act, it becomes more difficult. When you print money, you do not make productivity. You just make more money. He doesn't have any value, okay? The more money you make, it's okay, double the amount of money. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we just could double the amount of money and then have benefits from it? But it doesn't give you anything, really, okay? It's only productivity that gives you something.